afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the February 15th, 2001 meeting of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee. We can start with introductions. I am myself, Vice Chair Braxton Winston, also serving at large.
Tarek Bakari, Co-Chair.
Larkin Eggleston, Committee Member.
Good afternoon, Matt Newton, Committee Member.
Greg Phipps, Committee Member.
Dana Fenton, City Manager's Office.
Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Yeah, I guess I just demoted myself there, huh, Mr. Bakari?
I thought, I was like, wow, and the promotion, this is amazing. I got it.
Well, unless you have anything to say before we start, Mr. Bakari, I'd say we can turn it right over to Mr. Fenton to get into these legislative updates.
Yeah, I would just add one little thing, which is we are in the throes of the process that is right after what you saw us doing all in the last year of developing this legislative agenda. So now it's more about the deployment. So a lot of our work isn't so much about the policy discussion of what goes into it, which you've seen for months and months and months. Now it's more about having the conversations and really lobbying for what we've decided Charlotte most needs. So I think that's kind of, it'll be a little more of a status update and a little less meaty than our normal conversations from Mr. Fenton, just as a note for those watching at home.
And before I give it up to Mr. Fenton, I would be remiss not to welcome back committee member Greg Phipps, his first meeting with us on the IG committee. So, you know, we'll work on getting him caught up about what Mr. Bakari has said, because we have done significant amount of work in the past year dealing with everything that we've been dealing with.
And don't worry, Mr. Phipps, we are prepared to take it slow, show you the ropes of how City Council works. We will be as patient as you need, sir. Any words you'd like to say as we welcome you to the committee?
I'm just honored to be back on the committee. I was on this committee a while when I was before I retired from council, so I'm glad to be back to roll up my sleeves to get going on this important work.
And we got a rapid sign from Larkin. We will go to Mr. Fenton.
Thank you, Mr. Winston, Mr. Bakari, and members of the committee. For the record, I'm Dana Fenton with the City Manager's Office, and the first order of business today is the state legislative update. But before I get to that, let me say just two things. Mr. Bakari, you're absolutely right. We are in that phase now where we're talking about deployment. And so for this meeting and all the upcoming meetings through at least June, you will always have a state legislative update and a federal legislative update on your calendars. If there's anything else to be discussed, committee referral, et cetera, that will be denoted on those upcoming agendas. And second of all, I'd like to say before I begin is that we have the crew from Kilpatrick Townsend, our state contract lobbyist. I saw Ches McDowell, Nelson Freeman, Amanda Donovan, and John Easterling on there. I'm glad to have them all on here. And let's go to the first slide of the legislative update. Just briefly before I get into this one, the General Assembly returned to session last month. They came back for one day on January 13th for an organizational session. Then they came back 2 weeks after that on the 27th to begin their session in earnest. And so far they have taken up a few issues in terms of COVID relief, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But I just wanted to make sure that everybody was aware going forward this year. Take a look at the composition of both the House and Senate of the General Assembly. In the House, I know some of the committee members have seen this before, is that there are 69 Republicans and 51 Democrats. The Republicans did pick up 4 seats in the last election. And in order to overturn vetoes that the governor issues, there have to be at least 3 Democrats who join with all Republicans to successfully override that veto. Last session, that magic number was 7. So as we go ahead in the session here, I'm sure that we will be seeing potential veto opportunities out there. In the Senate, the numbers stayed just about the same. There is one more Democrat than there was before November, 28 Republicans and 22 Democrats in total. And there would have to be 2 Democrats to join all Republicans to successfully override a governor's veto. Next slide, please. And here is where I'm going to ask our folks from Kilpatrick Townsend to chime in as well. I'll go over a few of these things, and I'm sure that our crew there will have things to say about these as well. But looking ahead at the session right now, there are really 4 big areas that the leadership will be focusing on. One is the budget and the issue of do we have issue area budgets or full budgets? As you all recall, in the last 2 years, we haven't had a comprehensive full budget. We've had these mini budgets, or what we call issue area budgets. Certainly there is a lot of hope that a comprehensive full budget can be reached this year, but we'll have to look at this more as time goes by. Let's talk about COVID legislation for a minute. A few things that the General Assembly is looking at in terms of COVID. One is that they have passed legislation, the governor signed into law, to change some policies based on the most recent federal legislation from late December. And a lot of that had to do with moving up timeframes and making other changes like that, I would term more technical. They also did take the chance to appropriate some dollars for K-12 education, emergency rental assistance, and vaccine distribution, but they still have more of those dollars to appropriate from that last federal bill. They're also looking right now at K-12 education and about reopening schools. It's a very interesting thing to watch because the General Assembly has appropriated quite a bit money for schools to reopen. In the last piece of legislation that passed, there was $1.6 billion set aside for K-12 education to help them reopen. And so this is a legislation that the House and Senate leadership really want. The governor would prefer that school districts voluntarily reopen. And then you have some others who are very concerned that what school districts have done so far has not been enough to keep teachers and students safe. So that's an issue right now. That bill is in a conference committee of the House and Senate, and there should be some resolution I would expect some legislation to be sent to the governor later this week. And then we have economic recovery. In that federal legislation from last month, there's still about $1.8 to $2 billion to be appropriated for economic recovery. And we are expecting in the next few weeks for draft legislation to be released to be allocated to various state agencies. Department of Transportation stabilization, you all recall last year where the Department of Transportation had to cut quite a bit of funding from their budget due to an accumulation of things, not just the pandemic and the impact on revenues from that, but the department had issues before that. It wasn't all about just recovery from disasters like hurricanes and rock slides, but and also trying to deal with the impact of the abolition or the repeal of the MAP Act. But there were other things there as well that they are trying to overcome. The NC First Commission report came out earlier this year, and that report has called for alternatives to the gas tax. That is the additional cost put on a gallon of gas at the pump. In terms of, I think you've all heard about that issue when it comes to vehicle fleets getting better mileage. They're using less gas to go the same mileage. So that cuts into gas tax revenues over the long term. And then there's some other things in the NC First Commission report that could very well be discussed as well. Then the final thing I have on here is redistricting. And the state is, this is a year when the state would have to redistrict or will have to redistrict. It's the year after the census. And just so you know, that issue, which has been referred to the Budget and Effectiveness Committee on the delay in census data, also impacts state and county elections as well. The state will come back, the General Assembly will come back in October to do that work, and you could see some other changes as well at that point in the future. And next slide, please. We wanted to go over with you some of the key House committees and key Senate committees and their leadership, just to show you where the leaders are from. Again, we've talked a lot in past years about the rural-urban divide, and we probably saw a continuation of that here in this last election. There were the Republicans did pick up some seats in some areas that were Democratic in the last cycle. Next slide, please. The Appropriations Committee. We have the committee itself, along with a couple of the subcommittees. For the most part, the senior co-chairs in Appropriations are Dean Arp from Union County, Donnie Lambeth from Forsyth, and Jason Sane from Lincoln. And I believe that Dean Arp was a co-chair or a vice chair of that committee back in the last session. And then we have a couple of the subcommittees that local governments usually have to go through for one thing or another. And I think you can tell there that we have mainly rural and suburban counties, representatives from those counties chairing those committees. The biggest change was in the Transportation Appropriations Subcommittee, where Brendan Jones is now the senior chair. He's from Robeson County. And our good friend John Torbett used to be the senior chair. He is no longer on any of the transportation committees, whether appropriations or policy. Next slide, please. Here are three committees: Commerce, Finance, and Local Government, that we have to go through quite a bit. I highlighted that Mr. Bradford from the 98th House District here in Mecklenburg County is a senior co-chair of the Finance Committee. That is a good thing for the city of Charlotte. And then the other committee chairs, co-chairs, were also co-chairs in the last session. Next slide, please. And then finally, in the House, there is a new committee called Local Government, Land Use, Planning, and Development. We would see typically things here, I believe, that we would normally have just seen at a local government committee, but things that have to do probably with building permits, with other policies that local governments put in place to protect the environment while planning for new homes and businesses will probably be heard in this committee. And then, of course, on the Transportation Committee, John Torbett is no longer a co-chair of that committee. And then probably one of the more important committees in both chambers, the Rules Committees, Destin Hall, who is, I believe, in his third term from Caldwell County, up in the foothills near Blowing Rock in Boone, is the chair of that committee. Next slide, please. Let's get to some Senate committees following there. Next slide, please. On the Base Budget Committee, Kathy Harrington from Gaston County, along with Ralph Heiss from McDowell and Brent Jackson from Sampson, are the co-chairs. Also, I would point out that Senator Harrington is the Senate Majority Leader. I think many of you have read that already. And then on the appropriations for the Department of Transportation, someone that many of us have met, or many of you have met with before, Senator McGinnis from Scotland County, and is a co-chair. He was a co-chair last year. In addition to that, Senator Sawyer from Iredell County has now come up to a co-chair position. The other co-chair last year decided to retire and did not run again. And then we have some other folks on the general government and the justice and public safety. And I think quite a few of you have met Senator Ted Alexander from Cleveland County. Next page, please. Commerce, Finance, and State and Local Government Committees. Most of these chairs are from more rural counties, but you do have a few who represent some more urban areas, like Senator Edwards represents Asheville, and Senator Johnson represents Union County. And then on the Finance Committee, the second Senate chair, Paul Newton from Cabarrus County, is a chair as well. And next slide, please. And then just finishing up with Transportation and Rules. Bill Rabin continues as the chair of the Rules Committee. He's from Brunswick County, near New Hanover County in Wilmington. And then the Transportation Committee, Senator Britt, Senator McInnes, and Senator Sawyer. So Senator Sawyer from Iredell County is a person that I think you all will want to get to know better. And then finally, on the last slide, we have the Bill Deadlines Committee. The Senate bill filing for local bills, all local bills have to be in by or be filed by March 11th, and their public bills, which are basically everything else, has to be filed by April 6th. The House has gives folks a few more weeks for each category. Local bills have to be filed by the 25th of March, with the non-revenue public bills being in by April 20th, and then revenue bills by Tuesday, April 27th. And then finally, the all-important date of crossover is Thursday, May 13th. That's the date by which most legislation, including your local bills and your non-revenue public bills, need to be out of their house of origin and in the other chamber in order to be considered further in the long session and subsequently in the short session next year. Mr. Chairman, or co-chairs, that completes my presentation. I might want to flip to our team from Kilpatrick Townsend to see if they have anything they'd like to add to that.
Go ahead with that before we get into questions.
Sure.
Dana, I'm happy to step in. This is Nelson Freeman. The only things that I would add is that there will be a persistent asterisk on what the legislative agenda for the state looks like, depending on what occurs at the federal level, as there continues to be discussion over either a transportation infrastructure, and I use infrastructure in some very large air quotes because there's a lot that would be included there, as well as a supplemental and an additional COVID relief bill that will cause a lot of decisions to be made at the state level as those funds are appropriated for those various purposes. And so I know Dana will get to what the federal update is, but those decisions will have a dramatic effect on what the state will be making decisions on over the next 6 to 12 months.
Yes, good. Thank you. That makes sense. And I just add, there's a lot of information there. Some of it is only relevant to us nerds who care about who got what committee posting. But if I was to just lay out the big ticket items I'm keeping my eye closely on, one, what is the next round of economic COVID recovery relief going to look like, and how does that relate to what we need to do to anticipate it? Two, clearly losing Torbett in that transportation leadership position as he moves over into education leadership is going to be a significant headwind for an already challenging process for transit funding. Three, very interested in Bradford and his post in finance leadership now, and to see how that's going to play out. I think that's very interesting. And then four, we've talked about it numerous times for a long time, the implications should it truly be September that we are going to get the census data back, because if you play out any even the tightest timelines, that does not put us on a path of allowing for redrawing, filing, primaries, and generals. So there's about 43 or so municipalities in North Carolina that have districts, and this applies to, Charlotte being one. Interestingly enough, Kings Mountain is another. But there are 500 that are not and do not have districts, and this is not a problem for them. So I have already made sure that leadership up there is fully aware, and they are, of the magnitude of this information, because it's either very simply a municipal level decision or a state level decision, but it will have a lot of implications. So clearly that's going over to the Budget and Effectiveness Committee to come up with what our position is going to be, or what we need to do from a strategy perspective. But clearly the answer here is we have to partner with a lot of different entities outside of our own government here. So an intergovernmental approach is necessary. Braxton, any final words from you before we open up for questions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I see Mr. Phipps has his hands up, and I just want to, stay on that last point that Mr. Bakari was making. I know he has been engaged, as he said, and I am engaging as well as early as this morning. We can decide what we're going to do through Budget and Effectiveness Committee, but this is quite literally, again, a separation of power kind of issue. If we don't have clear guidance from Raleigh about how we approach this, we're going to be in trouble. I would really think that we need to look at this, one, from a legislative agenda perspective. How does the change and possibility in the change of an election, again, not just the individual political races, but the possibility that referenda won't be possible this year. How does that affect our legislative agendas that we have currently adopted? But also, I think we need the General Assembly to weigh in here as we kind of continue to craft our internal strategies around some very complex and important issues. When we're talking about referendum, we're talking about the possibility of transportation and transit and mobility investment. That's already a complex conversation that we're having with the community. This can make it more complicated if we don't have clear guidance about what we should expect. So I think we need our local delegation to kind of weigh in on this kind of quickly and figure out, what kind of coalitions or what is the feeling from across the state about where we're heading. I think it's going to be immensely important and is probably one of the most complex things that we're dealing with at this moment. 2021 coming in hot. Mr. Phipps. Unless
Yes,
that has some.
Okay. Yeah, I just had a housekeeping and administrative type question. I was wondering, when I was on council, we used to get, I don't know if you can see it, a book like this, the North Carolina Directory. When is this thing coming out? The state government directory.
I think we provided those to you. They normally come out at the beginning of session. So now that session has begun, I would imagine they'll start putting those together pretty soon. And once they do come out, we will get them for you again and send them over.
Good. Okay. Thank you.
Other questions?
I'd like to make a point.
Sure.
Dana's presentation was exactly spot on, but I think one thing that's important to notice in the spreadsheet when you go back through and look at, or the PowerPoint, when you go back and look at where these committee chairs are from, the value of this committee being intergovernmental relations. We may not have a whole lot of Mecklenburg representation as the chairman of these committees, but we do have folks from surrounding areas. A lot of Gaston, a lot of Iredell, a lot of Union, and that makes this committee's role even more important in connecting with the areas that aren't exactly Charlotte and aren't exactly Mecklenburg County, but the region is well represented, and figuring out how to use those relationships and use those connections will certainly add to our success.
Chaz, thank you for bringing that up. I know this is something that Mr. Bakari and I have been working on and trying to figure out how to do better and how to bring solutions forward so that the entire council can utilize, our intergovernmental connections and relationships to better our ends. So, I think, I would ask wherever you see opportunity for people on this committee to make those suggestions and make those connections, please do, because a lot of times that's just what the space is somebody helping to facilitate those meetings and those conversations that we don't know are also happening in amongst important people that we need to be having them.
Follow-up question for me is, I didn't realize, is that a new committee that's dealing with land use? And does anyone understand what's going on with that, because I think that could be very interesting, given the fact that we're on the verge of making the largest land use decision in the history of probably any municipality in North Carolina right now.
Yeah, Mr. Macari, this is Mr. Fenton. It is a new committee, and it could be, and I agree with you. I think it could be a very, very interesting committee for a lot of different reasons, not just because what you all are doing in terms of the proposed comprehensive plan, but because there's a lot of different land use issues around the state, and planning and development as well. And also the chair of the committee is very attuned to those issues. So I think it's going to be a very active committee.
Chair of the committee, do you know anything about that person's district, or
Yes,
how
sir.
they might fall out here?
Yes, sir. Mr. Brody he represents both Union and Anson counties. I can't remember which county he resides in, but nonetheless, he has a pretty pro-private sector approach to these issues. But he's also a person who's willing to listen. And I found him to be very engaging over the last couple of terms. I think this might be his 5th term in office now, but he's always been a really good person to talk to. But I think he definitely does bring a private sector approach to these issues.
Well, I will reiterate, and Dana, perhaps you can take this away with our consultant friends here as well. We've got an entire planning division working on the UDO and everything right now. And when you pair both what's going on in the courts right now in relation to deed restrictions being challenged, paired with the fact that we are poised to essentially rezone the entire city, I would think Raleigh would probably have some strong feelings about some of that, and it would be good for us to understand that sooner than later.
We understand you completely, Mr. Perhari. Thank you.
If there's no other, go ahead.
Yeah, if there are no more questions, I think Mr. Fenton, you can continue on with your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Winston. That completes the state legislative update, and we're now ready to switch to the federal legislative update. And I just want to, first of all, thank the team from Kilpatrick Townsend, Chaz and Nelson, for offering their insights as well. Moving on to the federal legislative update, we'll talk about first results from last year and then our priorities for this year, and then along with some administration priorities that have been high profile over the last few weeks. And finally, we'll talk about the Congressional City Conference that's scheduled for March 7th through the 10th. Next slide, please. In 2020, had a couple things there that we could point to. On the affordable housing front, in the bill that passed the Congress in late December, the Congress established a permanent floor for the 4% low-income housing tax credit, and you all may recall that, especially you, Mr. Winston, because you were serving in the Housing Recovery Task Force. That rate has not always been at 4%. It's floated, but now it's going to be at a permanent 4% rate, and it'll be more certainty for developers who want to help develop affordable housing out there. Then finally, the Community Development Block Grant Program. This is the funding you receive each year for housing in some other areas, and that total funding for the program nationwide was increased by $50 million. That just may not seem like a lot of money, but it's the last couple of years we have seen a steady growth in this program, which is a good thing, because about 10 years ago we were facing reductions in the program, and just 4 years ago the past administration was trying to repeal it altogether. Moving on to the Urban Area Security Initiative, the UASI. The Congress, in its December 2020 legislation, has required the I believe it's either the Federal Emergency Management Administration or the Department of Homeland Security to study the allocation formula for those funds. And of course, as you all recall, just last year or the year before last, we were pushed out of the funding stream for that program. We ranked, we're just 1 or 2 spots below where the last region was able to get funding. And then in terms of emergency relief, this wasn't part of our agenda, but it's something we're closely watching, of course. The city did receive substantial sums of money for aviation, housing, and homeless, and public transportation needs. And then, of course, the coronavirus relief funds that were directed to the city, you all were able to take those and put those into areas of the greatest need, like small business, some more money for housing, help bridge the digital divide, frontline worker needs, and things like that. So just wanted to point that out to you all. Next slide, please. Then in terms of our 2021 priorities, really three big things here. We have infrastructure or transportation infrastructure, comprehensive immigration reform, and COVID-19 guidelines for airport. We're going to talk about transportation and infrastructure in just a few more minutes in terms of what the Biden administration is proposing. But I do want to point out to you that there was something in the December 2020 package that included $3.2 billion to help low-income families secure internet subscriptions. Very, very similar to what we're asking for from the state. And that was something, Mr. Winston, I see you, you're doing the same thing I did. I was kind of shaking my head yes when I first saw this. And so there's a push now to try to get more money into that program at the federal level. $3.2 billion won't go too far. But also, I be honest with you, leading up to the enactment or to the release of that, I really didn't expect that to be in the package. So this is really a good thing, I think, in terms of what we want to try to do via the digital divide. And then on immigration reform, the administration has drafted legislation. I've checked, it has not been introduced yet. I'm sure it's being worked on quite a bit by House and Senate leadership. And then COVID-19 guidelines for airports. This is something that the Airport Recovery Task Force requested. And just days after taking office, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention issued a mask wearing order in airports, which goes a long way in helping to establish standard guidelines for all airports in the country to follow. Next slide, please. Let's talk about a little bit about administration priorities. We'll start with emergency relief and infrastructure to get into climate change, immigration, and racial equity. Next slide, please. Emergency relief, as you know, I'm sure you all have read that there is a $1.9 trillion emergency relief measure working its way through the Congress. The Congress has taken the step of using the budget resolution to get this passed, and what that does, it allows them to expedite the measure through the House and Senate, and also it allows the Senate to avoid having to get a 60-vote threshold in order to pass it. Now, you might ask, why don't we just use a budget resolution for everything? Well, there's only a few times a year that you can use it, unfortunately. So anyways, they're going to use it this one time for various things. Some of the things I have listed, I think, are more of interest to local governments, like vaccine distribution, more stimulus payments to families and individuals, unemployment assistance to do more with that. There would be about $350 billion set aside for state and local government aid, and that money would come directly to states, cities, and counties. And then there's talk about doing some more for transportation, whether it's aviation or public transportation. And then finally, the internet access that we talked about on the previous slide. And right now, the House and Senate committees are working on the policies to include in the package. And the House and Senate leadership is still aiming to get this bill onto the president's desk by early March. So that's only a couple weeks away. I guess we got 2 more weeks until March begins, and then after that, it could be maybe a few more weeks, but maybe by the next time we meet, or by the time that we talk with our congressional delegation, there may be legislation on the president's desk. Next slide, please. With infrastructure, the leadership in the House and Senate see an opportunity to spend money on the different infrastructure items like public transportation, aviation, highways, passenger rail, electric vehicles, broadband, and potentially more areas. And it's about a $2 trillion they're talking about spending. And one of the things that the president wants to do is to spend $50 billion on road and bridge repairs in his first year in office. That's a lot of money, but I'm sure that state departments of transportation will find plenty of roads and bridges to repair if needed. And this legislation could be filed within the month, but I wouldn't suspect that passage will take place until several months down the road. So it could be a while before we have any idea as to when something like that might pass or even if it will pass. Next slide, please. I wanted to bring up these other areas because I know these are very important to you, the climate change, immigration, and racial equity and social justice, just to show you some of the actions that the administration has taken already. I'm not going to run through each of these, but I would be glad to get you all more information if you need anything about it. There's several things already that the administration has done on climate change. Basically, a lot is reversing the policies of the previous administration, like getting the U.S. back into the Paris Climate Agreement. Next slide, please. On the area of immigration, there are several things that the administration has done. Probably the biggest one is that they say they've announced their immigration legislation with a path to citizenship for 11 million undocumented immigrants in the country. Next slide, please. And here are a few more of the immigration things, actions they've taken. And then finally, racial equity and social justice. We have several things there as well, especially at the top. You may recall there were some regulations or policies that the previous administration was trying to undo when it comes to fair housing. And certainly this administration looks like it wants to do as much as possible for fair housing within existing laws. And then finally, committee, our last slide, upcoming March 7th through the 10th, in just a few weeks, about 3 weeks from now, I think, we have the Congressional City Conference, and we're already scheduling virtual briefings for mayor and council to brief our congressional delegation. And I know that staff has reached out, whether to your assistants or to yourselves, but they've identified times that we can meet, and we're working on trying to set up those meetings right now. And of course, we would have briefing books for you for those presentations. And again, these will be virtual briefings as opposed to, of course, to traveling up to Washington, D.C. So, committee, that's all I have for the federal legislative update. I'd be glad to answer any questions you may have. And also, I believe that Mr. Rios, Federico Rios, is also on this call in case you have any questions related to immigration.
Questions?
Unless you have one, Mr. Picard, I was going to.
No, Mr. Co-Chair, please go right ahead.
So one of the things I think we were really successful with in terms of our COVID money was not just being able to do things within our own framework, but we did extend our kind of intergovernmental approach in areas around homelessness and the digital divide, particularly with the digital divide and working with like CMS to provide more connectivity. That was something that we weren't sure that we could do going into it, but reading into the legislation, we were able to do one. I certainly believe that we are most impactful to our community when those intergovernmental kind of spends are able to occur. So I would ask you, Mr. Fenton, as these dollars are coming in, let's keep an eye out for opportunities where we can partner with other organizations to either lead or partner with them to think of some out-of-the-box solutions. I know, we're going to be dealing with this pandemic for a while, and the community is looking at us for solutions that only get done intergovernmental style. I'm thinking about homelessness and dealing with tent city. I'm thinking about the continued economic relief that is needed for small businesses and around housing and neighborhood support. The more that we know kind of going into it about where we can compel our partners to come along with us, I think will be very important as we continue to search for solutions in the pandemic. And then, of course, I know we had a lively discussion last week around source of income discrimination. I saw that as one of the priorities, the Fair Housing Act, and updating that as you were going through the new executive level priorities. We'll love to keep an eye on that and where is some space for some intergovernmental interaction with housing and urban development down here with our constituents around that subject.
Thank you, Mr. Winston. On the first subject you brought up on the funding, possible partnership with other organizations, we're always looking for that. Of course, But what we've also been hearing is that there will be more flexibility in the use of the funds that are given or that are directed by the federal government to state and local governments. So there could be some more opportunities there than we had seen before for partnerships.
Good, that's exciting.
Yes, sir. And then on the source of income discrimination issue, we'll keep a close lookout for that. I'll work closely with Ms. Weideman and her staff on that. And also, I would just point out for the benefit of the committee, the Great Neighborhoods Committee is going to discuss that very issue on this coming Wednesday, the 16th, or the 17th, I'm sorry. I think the committee meets at 12 noon that day.
Thank you very much. Mr. Phipps?
I'm aware that we've only so far scheduled one meeting, I guess, with Senator Tillis as part of the congressional meetings in DC. Do you have any idea when any other meetings will be scheduled with members of our congressional and senatorial delegations up in DC?
Yeah, Mr. Phipps, right now we're focusing on our 2 U.S. senators and our 2 U.S. representatives. And in terms of where they are, our lobbyists are where they are in the process of scheduling. I have not checked in with them. Today is President's Day, and they're off. But I'd be glad to check on that for the committee. I know that initial outreach has been made to all the 4 offices.
Thank you.
And perhaps as a good takeaway, this body from the intergovernmental perspective, paired with Ms. Dodson from the economic development side and Frederico from the immigrant kind of cross section of all of that, we can make sure that we are lining up how we're looking particularly at the next phase of economic recovery post-COVID and those topics. So Frederico, we appreciate you joining us, and perhaps that would be a great takeaway because I don't know that intergovernmental will drive that, but I think we could be one tool once we kind of figure out, what's going on. Are there disparities, things of that nature? And Frederico, I think you can keep us honest and make sure our fingers are on the pulse there. I see that we have Madam Mayor Vi Lyles, special guest joining this lowly committee meeting. Mayor Vi Lyles, it is an honor to have you. Would you like to say a few words?
No, I'm sorry. I just turned on my video. So I've just been listening and watching and appreciating the conversation and the report. So thank you.
Our mayor, she's everywhere, folks. She is everywhere. Thank you all. Mr. Winston, do you have any final thoughts, or are there any other questions before we call this one a wrap?
Well, I'd ask Mr. Fenton. I was just thinking as we were going through this, and as we kind of refine an intergovernmental approach, does it make sense, that we have a kind of an update or kind of any vision into what is happening on the county level for things? I know a lot of those approaches around COVID, around all these things that we're trying to do. Just wondering if the committee thinks, or if Dana thinks, if there is any relevance of kind of getting an update about what's happening downstairs from us kind of month to month.
Mr. Winston, are you thinking about maybe having a joint intergovernmental relations committee meeting of the county and city committees?
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's a kind of bigger picture. That's something that, again, Mr. Bakari and Mr. Jarrell and I have been doing. But I think even from that perspective, it's really important about the work that gets done between those meetings, so that we're in a better position to take advantage of those times when we do meet together. So just again, maybe I'm just kind of spitballing an idea out there, but how do we get smarter about those places where we interconnect and the conversations that we are having or could be having?
I'd be glad to do some thinking about that and get back to you. But I think, definitely, and probably within the next month or so, be difficult because of the congressional delegation briefings and all that. But But let me do some pondering on that
Yeah.
for you.
For instance, I'm sure they have a legislative agenda, you know what I'm saying, that is going on our behalf, since they do advocate on behalf of us. We are residents of the county. It might be wise for us to know what where they're going up to Washington, D.C. and advocating for as well,
Okay. Yeah, I'd be glad to get you their legislative agendas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. With that, I think we've had another meeting. Again, we are in that phase where it's execution time. So these are more status updates, many of which are more for the community as a whole. But it's always good for us to make sure we know who's in leadership positions, what's going on with other intergovernmental bodies or governmental bodies for that matter. So thank you all for joining, Mr. Phipps. Yes, sir.
Yes, I do. I would like to chime in and agree with Mr. Winston that I think it would be worthy and of benefit for us to be able to, I don't know, to see. I don't know if, I know in the past, I don't know how willing other bodies were to share their legislative agendas, but I think it would be worthy to know if the agendas are compatible in any kind of way, just to see what things are we going up there to advocate for, to see, just to compare notes, so to speak. So I would agree that I think it would be worthy that we would do something like that.
I totally agree. And since they're all public documents, I would think we'd all at least want to share them, if not figure out where there's synergies. So perhaps Mr. Fenton and Assistant City Manager Dodson could collaborate on a good way that we could accomplish at minimum info sharing and hopefully at maximum just a little more synergies. Great point, Mr. Phipps.
Mr. Bakari, I'd be glad to gather all those agendas and get them out to the committee.
Let's schedule a 3-hour meeting where we can discuss that as well.
A 3-hour meeting, really? I don't know when you're going to have it, but you can have a 3-hour meeting if you want to, sir.
Mr. Fenton, excellent job as always. Thank you and staff for preparing this. And unless anyone else has anything else.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
That's it.
Thank you, committee. Have a great day.